Morning all, or afternoon all. Let me just get the technical stuff working right. We are recording. Peter, I need to let you be make host. So Peter is now the host. Yes. Can everyone hear me? I can't hear you, Peter, so now we're going to just try and figure out what's going wrong there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Well, it's time for war, guys. I like saying that. There's something nice about that appeals to me. So we just thought we'd spend the first couple of minutes sorting out the technical gremlins, which will happen for those that are getting on. For those of you who don't know, I'm Mark Hartley. I'm the facilitator for tonight, and our host is Peter. He's our mediator and moderator. He's going to make sure that when I step over the line, and eventually I probably will, I'll get a stick for it, and also making sure you don't do the same. So I think we've given enough time for people to start joining. So I'd like to get on with the topics because we've got 30 minutes and a fair bit to get through. Just a reminder, the session is being recorded. We will do a short edit of the material and make it available after the event. Now, having said that, Peter, I want to...
Just a sec, Mark. I can see there's 9 people in the waiting room and 4 people in the meeting.
You should be able to let them
I need to admit them.
Yes.
That's my job. Okay, I'll do my job. Sorry.
So they're in, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, guys. So every now and again, there'll be a few more that'll probably pop up there, Peter. It's the new security requirements that Zoom has introduced in the last month. So there are requirements for you to get in now. Either have to control it one way or another, and Zoom has defaulted to needing you to be approved to come into the meeting.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, well, it is. So guys, first thing I want to talk about is this process. Well, actually before that, I'm not going wild. I just want to let you know that what's happening there is topical skin cancer treatment. Those of you who have played with it, Effudex, so it's just covered up to keep it more comfortable for me. It's not that I'm trying to become a modern hippie or anything like that. So first thing I want to talk about, why editing your templates needs to be an almost religious experience. And I thought a way of dealing with this might be the fact that I regularly, for those of you who know me, will know that my New Year's Eve gift to myself is spent editing my templates. That's one of my great delights in the year. And the reason I edit my templates then is it allows me for the period of the year to assess, have I learnt more about communication? Have I learnt more about grammar? Have I learnt more about arboriculture? So all of those things are being tested and checked in the process of me reviewing my templates. So I thought the easiest way to do it would be to show you what happens and why you need to do it more religiously. So if I can, and it will let me, I will share my screen. And will it let me? I don't know whether it will, but certainly let me show you this. Everyone see the word screen in front of you?
No. Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, we're there then. So this is a template that gets done over fairly regularly, and one of the reasons you need to regularly recheck your templates is, unless you're an English major or a journalist or someone who's very familiar with the English language, you're going to learn more about English during the course of the year. And the other day I did an update in my Grammarly software, which is the software that I use to check, and it's going to tell me that I can't use it. No, come on, there it goes. Okay. So Grammarly is going to start checking my templates. And I did an update to Grammarly the other day, about a month ago. And I noticed all of a sudden a whole pile of extra scribble. This is a report that was written in, let's have a look, 2018 or 2015. 4th of November 2020. And so since then, there's been a major update to the algorithm for Grammarly. And you can see there's lots of little things here that it's asking me to look at doing in terms of updating and sorting out. And some of those are minor, but some of those are really useful hints and useful information. So for example, this one here, the clients from, it should be the in there, you know, that's a really easy thing. Why has it been missed? Why did Microsoft miss it with its word? And the answer is it does. So I guess the take home lesson is, even when you think you've got your template right, take the time to periodically check through your templates. If you don't, then you are putting out documents that have potential issues or that may not be communicating as effectively as possible. And one of the things that this latest Grammarly change does is it helps rewrite some of the sentences. So here you got down the bottom right-hand side an alternate rendering of the sentence. Because there are several larger trees on and adjacent to the site, consideration should be given to installing a gutter system that will not be significantly impacted by leaves. And their suggestion is changing that last bit to that leaves will not significantly impact. And you can see how just a choice of a few words and changing things improves the communication process. So that is why going through periodically, updating your software, and the same issue happens, and it's something to be aware of. Peter, you can ignore this, and those of you who stray from the Microsoft domination. But the other thing that can happen is when you're working in, just going to move this, when you're working with Word, every now and again, Word won't be proofing the document, and you may not be aware of that. So always check that you've got options, proofing, and down the bottom it says exceptions for. Every now and again it'll hide these, and if it does, you won't find any of his spelling mistakes coming up or any grammatical errors. So just double check if you're getting things that you're typing incorrectly and you're not getting that indication that there's been an error. Then first of all, go to that process of checking that your proofing's in the right spot. So that's the first hint I've got for you today. Check your templates at least once a year or at every update, and that'll improve the quality of your end document. So I can close that one down now. And the next area we're looking at is communicating risk. And I shared a link to a document called the Minimum Performance Criteria for Tree Risk Assessment. Did everyone grab a copy of that and have a look? Thumbs up, yes?
Yep.
No? It is there? No, well, it's there. It's a hypertext link. Maybe I should have said, had it just as a hypertext link. So the meeting invite's got it. You can go grab it and download it. But it's Arboriculture's Australia Minimum Performance Criteria for communicating risk or doing a tree risk assessment. And I thought it would be worthwhile. Risk assessment is something that arborists do on a regular basis. And I thought it'd be worthwhile having a look at how do we communicate in those situations? What's important in that communication process? And the reason I put it there is because I received a a risk report for a school recently, and the phrase there in the meeting minutes is exactly what was in the report. The tree is possibly dangerous and should probably be removed. I'm not sure what it was that they were communicating. Certainly, I get the idea that there's a risk, but well, there's possibly a risk, and the tree should probably be removed. That doesn't mean that there is a risk, and that doesn't mean that the tree should be removed. It's very vague, and we shouldn't be vague when it comes to risk assessments. We should be at least somewhat concise. So Arboriculture Australia puts these things as their minimum performance criteria. First thing is it should be performed by a person who's been formally trained in tree risk assessment. Now, fortunately, it's very vague. It doesn't say exactly what qualification or what training is required. It just says you should be formally trained in that process of tree risk assessment. And so it does give a lot of scope in that regard. The second thing it says to do is state in unambiguous terms the method of tree risk assessment performed. So how did you assess the risk? Did you use a basic tree risk assessment from the track system? Did you use a quantitative system such as QTRA? Did you use the valid system and use the valid app? Then say what you did. And any limitations of the inspections that you have undertaken. So was it a quick walk-by inspection? Were you able to see the tree from all sides? Was it just from the ground? And for many of us, simply stating that the inspection was performed from the ground is essential. It's important that we communicate that limitation. Otherwise, the person who's reading the report could assume that you should have done an aerial inspection and you did an aerial inspection. So we need to avoid that confusion. And then there are limits to various systems as well. You may not have be familiar with the area. You might have been seeing it at an unusual time. For example, I know that I took a class from the Northern Rivers up to Alstonville Showground on a number of occasions. And you could assume from the average day that you were there that there's nobody there. I did a project recently at Fairfield Showground, much the same thing, until we got to the Wednesday, and all of a sudden there were 1,500 people there. And then the Saturday, 1,500 people were there. So again, you need to indicate that, you know, how you got to that stage of figuring out how the area is used. You need to state if any diagnostic testing was or wasn't undertaken. So if you've taken it, let them know. If you haven't, simply indicate that no diagnostic testing was undertaken. Now you've given them some of your method as well. The next thing the performance criteria requires is to demonstrate that the tree risk assessment followed a peer-reviewed published system designed for the purpose of assessing tree risk and not tree hazards. It's probably a little hard because at the moment, BTRA is somewhat peer-reviewed. QTRA has made amendments since its peer-reviewed paper was published. VTA still hasn't published, but the critical thing is that none of them are a hazard assessment system. And I've just been doing a little bit of writing on a publication for TAFE, and sure enough, with a quick search, I could find a hazard assessment done for trees rather than a tree risk, and that was submitted to a council for consideration and approval. And there's a big difference between a hazard and a risk, and hopefully everyone here is familiar with that. Again, if you got your visual screen up, just give us a hands up if you understand the difference between a hazard and a risk. Yeah. Okay, great. So hopefully most there. If you don't know the difference, it's really important that you do clearly conceptualize the difference between the two, because they are not the same. So that's the first thing. It's not to be a hazard assessment system. Yes, Peter.
Briefly, what is the difference?
Oh, the difference. Okay. A hazard is something that's got the potential to cause harm. And for that point, every tree is a hazard. For example, there are lateral branches that are held up against gravity that may fall and hurt somebody. That doesn't necessarily equate to a risk. For example, buildings are large, tall structures that are held up against gravity, but seldom do they fail, and the risk of them failing is really, really, really small. A better example might be a bullet. A bullet can kill somebody quite easily. But unless that bullet's in a gun and pointed at you and then fired, or has the potential to be fired, then the risk is quite small, ignoring house fires and things like that. So a hazard is just the potential to cause harm. And we're unusual in looking at trees because they are all potentially hazardous. Trees, by definition, are woody, shedding, perennial organisms. So they're long-lived, they're woody, and they've got these bits that are going to be shed regardless of what we do. But that doesn't mean just because it's got big limbs that the tree is a big risk. They're two separate things. So we might look at the size of those limbs and say, well, they're hazardous. And in the earlier days, that's in fact what we did, is we looked at Matheny and Clark, and oftentimes the manual wasn't followed, but even when it was, we tried to equate the hazard with a risk, and they're not equivalent. A hazard gives rise to a risk, but risk, for example, needs a target. And so we need to think about how often that target's there. And the minimum performance criteria, Peter, as we will get to, call upon us to do that.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Peter, for checking me up on that. So if you don't want to use a peer-reviewed published system, you're being very smart and think, I can do this all by myself. The answer is you can. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to come up with a risk assessment system. There's some wonderful books on how to do assessment, and you could sit down and create your own. And in writing the publication for TAFE to make sure I didn't breach proprietary information, I came up with a quantified system that was entirely fictitious called Quantitree, and I was able to document the processes that were involved with Quantitree to show that you can actually do it. And so you just need to demonstrate the validity of the system. So you need to demonstrate essentially that three key elements have been met. You consider the target, you considered the likelihood of the target being there, so target likelihood, and then the tree and the likelihood of a part falling. So that's our likelihood of normal risk equation. And the other part is a consequence. So I should say, Peter, that risk normally has two elements, likelihood and consequence. And that works really well with many risks. But trees falling can often involve a risk, a target that's not static, a target that's only there for a portion of the time. And so we need to say not just the likelihood of the part falling, but the likelihood of the target being there. And those two likelihoods go together. And that means a standard matrix, for example, and there's a professional organization who recently published a risk assessment system that only had one matrix, and that meant it could only have two variables. And in fact, there are always going to be three variables when we're considering risk of being impacted or hit by a tree. That is the likelihood of the part failing and the likelihood of the target being there. If you don't have a double matrix like you see with the track and basic tree risk assessment, so when I'm talking about BTRA or basic tree risk assessment, I'm talking about the basic system that the ISA publishes and makes available and that the track training is based around. For those of you who are curious, track is the tree risk assessment qualification. It doesn't actually tell you how you need to do the assessment. So a valid assessment or a QTRA assessment or a LANTRA assessment all meet the requirements of a track. Just keep that in mind when you're talking about those things. So it gets a little confusing on occasions. So I've tried to get away from using the phrase track except in regards to the qualification and BTRA in relation to the actual risk assessment. So you need to validate that system and show that it certainly meets those. a risk assessment should clearly indicate what trees are or aren't included. So if you've assessed the pine tree in the backyard, make sure that you make it clear that that's all you're asked to assess. Or if you're assessing all the trees on the property, indicate that it's all the trees on the property. And putting that in writing is important just to cover your own backside. Very few arborists get sued, but it does happen. And you want to make sure that you have communicated that you're asked only to assess the one tree if there are more trees on the property in particular. Then you want to state the Arborist document says the defects. I'd like to keep away from that word defect because defect is a misnomer. And to explain that very quickly, Peter, a defect implies that there's inadequacy or something wrong. And sometimes you can have a feature in a tree, like, for example, phellinus. Oftentimes, phellinus will make the tree produce more adaptive growth and it'll become stronger. So it's more than adequate. Included junctions are the same, those codominant stems with included bark. Sometimes that can actually result in a tree that's producing lots of adequate adaptive growth. And I've got photographs of situations where the stem above the point of attachment has failed rather than at the point of attachment. So you need to identify what it is that you're concerned about. You can't have an every way which guess. And an every way which guess is, it could be the codominant stem, it could be the dead branch, it could be a branch. And the reason a branch is a problem is that I don't know which branch it is. I need to know what it is that's abnormal. If it's just a branch, then it's the same as every branch in the tree, and every branch in the tree poses the same situation.
Hello, what's happened?
Yeah, there
We all got muted.
Yeah, I got, yeah, I don't know why I did that, but that's okay. So yes, if you consider one branch in a tree to be a problem, then every similar branch is a problem. And if you can't figure out why it's a problem, then every branch is a problem. We need to cut every branch off every tree. And then we wrap everyone up with cling wrap, let them die, and we realize we're stupid. So you've got to be able to not just say, I'm concerned about a particular branch, but what it is or why you're concerned about that. Next thing that you need to do is you need to demonstrate in determining the risk that you considered the likelihood of the said tree or part failing, the likelihood of the target being impacted. So you've done the three components. And then finally, when you're considering consequence, and this is something that was really important that we learned during a risk debacle about a decade ago, you need to consider not the worst case scenario, but the most likely scenario associated with risk. If you go for worst case, you'll always grossly overestimate risk. And a good example comes from getting a phoenix spike. Everyone at some stage or other has worked on or knows of someone who's worked on a phoenix canariensis and got a spike. I'm going to assume that's the case. There was a case or an incident about 20 odd years ago where an individual was spiked, got septicemia and died. Now, if we did a risk assessment with a phoenix palm and said, if you get a spike, you will die, you can see how that grossly overestimates the likely outcome. The most likely outcome for a phoenix spike is probably first aid and maybe a day or two off work. So, you know, it's probably something that's limited around about $500 or something, and probably more likely to be $100 or $200 worth of harm rather than death. And if we quantify death using value of statistical life from the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet, that's currently sitting just around $5 million. So big difference between $500 and $5 million. Now, where possible, the next requirement is to put the end result against the end output against known things where you can. So is what you've done a reasonable set of assumptions, and are they realistic? So again, if you were to look at it and say, well, look, using the BTRA, occupation rate is occasional. Why have you said it's occasional? Is that realistic? And is the end result of low or high a reasonable end outcome? And if we look at it, each year in Australia, about 5 people are killed by trees, or about 1 in 5 million per annum. If you've gone through an area and looked at some trees over a few days, or you've done 20 or 30 tree risk assessments over a period of a year, and most of them are sitting in the high, or most of them have a tree that's at an unacceptable level of risk, or down around that 1 in 10,000 mark if you're quantitative, something's awfully odd. It's not stacking up with the data. Could it be possible? Yes, everything's possible statistically, but it's really unlikely. So we should be getting, most of the assessments we do should be getting trees that are well and truly within the acceptable range, unless all that you're looking at is trees that, for example, have had roots cut by a utility installer installing underground services or something like that. Then you might have an unusual spike, and you should be able to justify that. Then interesting, the next requirement from Arborist, point 9, is where the information is provided in writing. And I would tell you to never, ever do a risk assessment, even for a friend, without something just being in writing afterwards. By the way, if you're doing it for a friend and a friend thinks that you're doing it because you want to continue to be his friend, Peter, and you do that as a freebie, there's still a contract there, and you still owe a duty of care. You're not absolved of it, because if you're doing it to maintain or keep the friendship, it could be argued that that's a part of the contractual process. That is consideration. You're getting something out of it. So even for my parents or my family, I would always give just a very simple formalized report. And to be honest, the most common risk assessment report I write is, there were no features in this tree that gave rise to the concern that this tree may be anything else but an average tree in and around areas of high urban use. And as such, the tree poses a risk that is already broadly acceptable. I'm looking for something that's extraordinary, because if we think the average tree poses a risk of harm of about risk of mortality of about 1 in 10 million, we're really looking for a tree that's somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times more likely to harm you. So it's got to be something that's exceptional. And when we talk about areas of high urban use, we're already talking about target zones that are occasional or frequent if you're using BTRA. So we're already talking about areas that we're dealing with normal trees anyhow. So we've got to have some reason to believe that this tree is significantly worse. The last 2 items are optional in case you decide to give it verbally. And in addition, a tree risk assessment should be, not must be, should be in writing, and the information has been communicated clearly to allow independent review and to provide documentation trial. And the thing here that's critical is, if we're looking at a process of saying, look, I think the occupation rate's occasional. The part I'm concerned about is a codominant stem with a partial failure. And the occupation rate, I'm guessing, is, and the consequence is, everyone should be able to check that. It doesn't mean that I'm right. It doesn't mean that you're right. But the fact that we can sit down and say, look, we agree on the target occupation rate, we agree on the part of concern, we just don't agree on the probability of failure, that allows us to at least engage as experts into clearer, less confrontational communication, or at least see and understand where the differences are. The last point is one, again, that came out of a paper by myself, Mark Stewart and Douglas O'Callaghan, on looking at risk and looking at QTRA and the importance of benchmarks, importance of looking at things that will help us be able to fit in where things are. And Arbos has on their website a paper that was done by Jessica Chalk and myself that lists down a number of things that give you some benchmarks, like the risk of dying in a car accident. And they're all fatalities. And the reason I use fatalities, by the way, is everyone knows what dead is. Dead is not questionable. If we look at something apart from dead, we could be looking at something that's anything from a scratch to permanent disability. And there's such a broad range. Working with serious injuries or incidents is not as easy to work with. So benchmarking is there to help the risk manager understand. We often use words like low, medium, and high, and they're fine, or acceptable and unacceptable. And when you see, for example, trees where an average tree falls in that 1 in 10 million mark, and then you think, well, where does that fit with other things? And you see beds fitting in there, less than 1 in a million. Most people don't think of sleeping as a dangerous activity. Stairs, again, much lower than that 1 in a million mark. Chairs sit close enough to the 1 in a million mark. They're all things. I'm sitting on a chair now, and yes, I could lean back, I could unbalance myself, I could hit my head, and I could die. The odds of that are about 1 in a million. It'd be more dangerous if I stood on it. That'd make it even more likely that I'm going to die at 1 in a million. But again, it's small, and helping people understand where the risk of trees fits against other societal risks helps them understand whether they need to do something or not. And that's important whether you've quantified the risk or whether you're using qualitative terms. To say low doesn't mean a lot, and you might not know exactly where it goes, but if you say, look, low's the average tree, if low's the bottom line, it is in BTRA, nothing can get lower than low. If it's already low, it's already most likely well and truly within that broadly acceptable range. And so it's something that is lower risk than a bed, lower risk than stairs, lower risk than standing up over the top. Reese has asked me a question. He says, Mark, do you have a broad statement in every report? I use benchmarks of some description in every report to do with risk. My most common one's the Health and Safety Executive, which says the risk of mortality from trees in and adjacent to areas of high public use is about 1 in 10 million. So that's available from the Health and Safety Executive of the UK. And I think that's a really good benchmark to work with. We're looking for something that's a lot higher than that. And if it's something like a school report, I have a whole section on how to assess risk and how the difference between hazards and risk, because most schools, most principals don't understand risk well. In fact, most arborists struggle with it. So it's fair that we do our best to communicate, Reese. And so I have typically there a scale of benchmarks from 1 in 20,000. I have asthma attacks. I have things that are commonplace that people can say, wow, okay, well then trees really aren't that higher risk. My standard opening comment to a principal will be, I probably shouldn't be here, but I am, and my super fund thanks you. In real terms, most of what we're doing with risk assessment is a tick and flick or a process of going through and meeting requirements. Every now and again, you'll get something that's gnarly or difficult, but that's the rarity. Any other questions on that? Of course, you're free to use those risk comparisons. If you do use them, just do the quote, or alternatively go do the hard yards and find some things that meet your sense of humour. I certainly like the death by animals. That's about 1 in 800,000. And just remember, in a country as dangerous as Australia, with as many horrible, toxic animals and nasty things that bite, our most dangerous animal by a long way is the horse. I find that humorous to sort of have to say that. I've just had to do a emergency management plan for a property that we Airbnb under the new regulations in New South Wales, and to let them know that beware of our dangerous animals, particularly horses, is not just tongue-in-cheek, it's a reality. Horses do kill more people in Australia every year than sharks and crocodiles and snakes combined. So,
mostly if you ride them though, surely, Mark.
yeah, yes, well, I have to get close to them. Horses can kick and kill. Yes, riding is certainly a high risk activity. It's like motorcycles. Going to a motorcycle show is not so much dangerous as getting on a Harley Davidson and trying to go through the S-bends of an area occupied by trucks. So I guess, guys, the next thing to do is we'll be back again in a month. We've done our half an hour, but what I do need to know is what topics. So if you've got any topics you'd like to have discussed at war, then please let me know. Some people have offered to send me some reports to discuss, and we will discuss the issues with the reports, but we have to do it in a way that we don't want to identify or embarrass anyone apart from myself or those that put their hands up and say, yep, please see my mistakes. And I've got some doozers out there on the internet that you can go have a look at. But yes, we will go through individual reports, but there's actually any topic to do with report writing that you want to have done, then we'll go into it. Discussion around trees impacting building properties. You find it difficult to write. I don't know who wrote that one. That doesn't tell me. There's that Reese again. Sorry. Yes, Reese. Okay. Certainly that's something that we can do. And again, it's just about learning how to follow a scientific or a technical format for writing, and learning how to reference and research. And we can look at all of those things, how to research, how to use Google Scholar, how to start gathering information and having a resource file. So that's it, guys. Then at 19:06 or 7:06, we've finished for the night. We'll be back in a month's time. I believe the next date is the 24th. Is that right? Is that a Monday? Next month, I'm traveling all around the state if they let me, or all around the country. And the 24th, yes, it's just before I head off to Perth. So the 24th, 6:30 till 7 p.m. And I'll send you out an invite earlier this time rather than later. Any other questions? Okay, guys, I thank you for having war with me, and look forward to going to war with you again.
Okay.
See you guys.
Thank you.